today's session is about learning about experiences when making the transition, because we get trained as astronomers, so it can be quite intimidating trying to switch to a different position. And the other bit of it, what we'd really like you to take away from this session is how to convert your existing CVs, academic CVs, and convert them, at least get ideas about how to convert them into an industry resume. Some of you have already submitted resumes and gotten feedback. Hopefully that's been helpful. Your moderators for today is me. I'm at the Center for Astrophysics at Swinburne, and Anshu, my name is Manodip Sinha, and Anshu, who's at Karin. We are both members of the ASA ECR chapter steering committee. Okay. As with all meetings, this meeting is being held on stolen land. So there's the acknowledgement of country, which is in the spirit of reconciliation. The ASA ECR chapter acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. This is a meeting that's supported by the ASA, so it's covered by the ASA Code of Conduct, which is that the ASA is committed to making ASA organized, sponsored, or supported meetings, events, and publications inclusive, productive, and enjoyable for everyone, regardless of age, carrying responsibilities, cultural diversity, disability, gender, indigeneity, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical appearance, or religion. So effectively, this is you're bound by this code of conduct. So if you want the exact details, the link is outlined. One thing I should mention that this is being recorded, and it will be posted on YouTube later on. So if you don't want to show up in the video, in the recorded video, please have your cameras off. We won't be discussing anything sensitive, presumably, but that's this recording is to enable others to view later. That helps. All right. So for today, as I was saying, the primary goal of today is to learn about an experience, and in terms of applying and learn from people that have made the shift. Caitlin, unfortunately hasn't had a last minute issue. So she unfortunately can't be here. So we'll only have a single speaker, unfortunately. That's it is. So what we will do is we'll have the talk by Iraklis, I'll introduce. And after that, we'll take a quick break. And then we'll have a breakout session where everyone is going to speed read resumes. The reason why we are doing this is to sort of hammer home the point that as scientists, we are trained to go into details, and we are trained to talk about the specifics of what you did. That's what academic CVs tend to contain. Whereas when you're going for an industry job, frequently there might be a machine that reads your resume, you might get rejected. And then usually it's an HR person or someone that has no idea about your field, right? So you have to convey your worth and what you bring, what you add to the company, to your employer with your resume, to someone who doesn't know what you do, who doesn't know what your skills are, right? So that's a skill of portraying your actual academic CV into a resume. So we will speed read through a bunch of resumes and try to gauge what sticks out, what you take away, what makes the most impact to people that don't know the field and that are really reading through thousands of these resumes per day. Right. Once we do that, we'll come back from the breakout room and we'll come into the group discussion. So once again, the people that are, if you have any questions at any stage, please feel free to type them into the chat box or just use the raise hand feature. Anshu is going to keep an eye out and just interrupt as and when possible. So the first bit, unfortunately, Caitlin couldn't make it. So we will, Iraklis, so Dr. Hercules Konstantopoulos is going to be the first speaker. We are very lucky to have him on here. And so he grew up in Greece. And of course, in Greece, you have fantastic night skies. So it's not surprised that you would want to be an astronomer. Then he spent a decade in astronomy in 4 continents. And then later on, he moved on to solving bigger and better problems, data problems, through in other areas, so like sustainability, energy, and enterprise software. So what we will have is this session with Iraklis first. Iraklis is going to show you the slides, and then we can have a Q&A. If you have any questions regarding the experience, then we will have that. Thank you, Iraklis. I'm going to stop my shares if you wanted to.
Fantastic. Thanks. Will do. Thanks, Andy. Let me just see if this will work. Can everybody see my screen?
Beautiful. Perfect.
And can you see me scrolling through another slide? No? Yes?
We see a second slide.
Okay. Magic. Works the first time. So thanks so much for having me. I'm known by many names, 2 names. My Greek name, which is the one astronomers know because that's what on my papers, my passport name, and the name that goes in my CV, which is a lot more legible. They're both the same name, but transliterations. So Iraklis is the passport name. Hercules is what it means. It goes from Iraklis to Hercules in Latin to Hercules in English over the millennia. So if you ask people around in energy, tech, and all that, they won't know who Iraklis is. But if you ask about Hercules, what's a what in astronomy, they won't know who that is. So that's just adding to the confusion of this talk already. So you're welcome. So thank you so much for the intro, Manad. It was really cool. So this is the schematic view of what you just gave in the intro, which is that I moved around a lot because thanks to astronomy. So it was a fantastic wild ride for about 10 years. Well, I guess 15 if you count undergrad and all that. So I moved to the UK to study. It's exactly what you said. So it was when I was a kid, I would look up at the sky. It was amazing. I grew up in the country. And there was never a consideration of doing anything else with my life when I was 8 years old. So that's everything I did from 8 to 30 years old or whatever was how do I become and remain an astronomer? So I went to the UK specifically UCL, because it was the only really good university I could find where I could kind of eligibly get in the EU, where they would allow me to take astronomy and telescopes from year 1. And that was my one requirement. I was just crazy about telescopes. So I did my degree at UCL, I stuck around there for my PhD. Then I got to go to Chile for a project at ESO. Then I got to do a project at Gemini, happy times at telescopes. That was always my driver. Then I moved to the US for a few years for a postdoc. Then I moved to Australia for another postdoc at the AAO, RIP AAO, which was a great time. And I worked on the AAT, I worked on the SAMI survey, which is still going on. It's now expanding to Hector and all those things. So I got to work with people who built telescopes and instruments for telescopes. And I got to do a lot of the data work for the instruments. That was kind of my specialization from even my my PhD onward. Actually, even my undergrad, I was building data pipelines. So when I kind of became a little bit uncomfortable in academia with certain things, you know, I still miss certain aspects of academia. I definitely miss the telescopes, as you can tell. And I miss working with super duper intelligent people every day of my life. I've been very lucky to work in really good places where I have access to a lot of smart people, but just the selection of people who go into PhDs and into academia is just a different orb. So you get to work with just really curious, really ingenious people every day. And if there's one thing I miss, that's probably it. So I moved away from academia about, I don't know, 8 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, something like that, somewhere thereabouts. And I was mostly kind of, I thought, looking at the statistics, I thought most staff and professors and whatnot spend 44% of their time writing grant applications. And that was definitely souring sort of the mood for me about how excited I was to be involved in this. I really wanted to be doing research. And at that time, around 2014, 15, was when data science was on the up and up, and the promise of going to a place where I just get to do research with other smart people was a really great prospect. So that's why I moved away. So that's the last two parts of this map, moving away from academia while I was still in Australia, and having the great fortune to start working in sustainability, decarbonization, carbon accounting, all kinds of aspects of this work on climate change, really. And then a couple of years back, it was another really happy occasion of work that brought us to New Zealand. So my wife got a job offer to work at the film studio here, Weta Digital, which is the studio that made Lord of the Rings and all these amazing things, and Avatar and all these really cool movies. So we moved here, and then I got lucky again and got to found another job in energy technology, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But let's talk about the beginnings of how this happened. So it's all about positioning. It's all about really having the right things to say to the right people. A lot of this stuff we've already covered. It's not rocket science. It's really a few basic rules to follow, and then you're pretty well placed to just change careers. If I had to capture the switch in a nutshell, I'd say that my day-to-day is not very different. I have a desk job. I analyze data. I collect, collate, look for, process, and analyze data. You know, 90% of my job is still cleaning data like it was in astronomy. It's not really different. So I'm just solving problems. I don't know that it's better problems, but it's definitely bigger problems in terms of just how many tentacles climate change has as a problem. So it's definitely not an environment where you can have a sort of linear-ish research program as you do in a research job, in a university job, an academic job, where you say, well, this is my 5-year plan. You know, when you're a postdoc or even a grad student, they'll tell you, always have what's your 5-year plan? If all of your grants come through, all of your telescope proposals come through, all your computing proposals come through, what are you going to be doing for the next 5 years? And you can answer that question. That's not where I am now. But the day-to-day is quite similar. in that I just solve problems as they come along, and I try to pick the jobs if I'm lucky to pick a job, and I try to pick the projects if I have the luxury of picking a project that will be sort of the more open-ended, the more research-looking sort of project of the lot. And for the most part, I've been lucky to have that happen, but it's not as kind of meaty, the big meaty projects. So that's a bit of a long-winded sort of tangent, but the point of that is to reinforce what one of you said before, which is that you're talking to people who have no idea what you're doing. And it's not because they don't understand the world, it's just that they don't know academics. We tend to cluster a little bit. It's a little bit our fault. So, you know, because of the way that our sector works in academia, you're not likely to have had a chat with a recruiter at a tech company. Maybe tech company is not the best example, because by this point, tech companies go to career fairs, campus recruiting, and things like that. But in general, at what we call industry in academia, you probably have never had a chat with a recruiter until you're looking for a job in industry. And they've never had a chat with anybody who is a real bona fide researcher. So it's just through a lack of exposure, they just don't know what researchers do. So there's a few tips to do CV stuff, but I put this slide up before so I don't forget. CV writing is one thing, and then there's also all the ancillary things in the periphery of how you look for a job. So again, it's going away from the specificity is one thing, but really spreading the message in the right places is just as important, because you can send a whole bunch of CVs, but if you're an unknown entity, it's always just the CV that people see and no association. So for the most part, in my career outside academia, I did the same that I did for my career in academia, which is to just meet people and not be an unknown person when I apply for a job. It's a little harder in industry because there's just so many jobs you could be applying for that you probably won't know people when you actually apply for a job. But if you go to meetups, if you go to conferences, if you go to any kind of place where you can meet people who are looking for who have jobs to offer, then you're likely to get an in that way. So when I started applying for jobs out of academia, it was not easy. I'm not going to lie. Getting that first gig is really hard. And sending out CVs just didn't work for me. It has worked for people, and it does work sometimes. And it's getting better now that people are understanding what academics do. But it's just not as a surefire a way of applying for a job as it is to just meet people, figure out who has jobs, have a chat, tell them what you do, so you're a living, breathing person, and then that sets up a very different foundation. I realize that this is difficult right now where every event is virtual. It looks like people are pretty keen to get back into in-person events, so some meetups are going to be moving in that direction. If they don't, and if it remains virtual, it remains online, that's definitely harder. It's definitely going to put a bit of a spanner in the works. But people are pivoting and they're moving to sort of networking events online, breakout rooms and the such. So I'd say meetups and things like that are still a very good way to go, if for no other reason, because there'll be a bunch of speakers or a panel or whatever. They'll give out their email addresses, and then you can just call them. You can just drop them a line, and the reason they're there is to recruit or to be recruited. So it's very implicit in the whole arrangement of a meetup that you're there for jobs, you're there for networking. It's not really, oh, look at the wonderful project I just did, in a vacuum. It's not in a vacuum. It's really all about jobs. And the last thing I'll say about this, actually, no, I have two bullets there to talk about. One thing is I hate meetups. I hate them. I'm not naturally this way. So I have to really, really put myself in the zone, get all my little things on my desk so I feel comfortable now that it's all virtual. Back in the day, it was even more daunting to go into a room full of people and just go chat to someone, name tag and, hi, I'm Hercules, I do sustainability. I hate it. It's not my natural state at all. But I had to convince myself to go, and this is what helped me, was that I have to meet one person. I go to this meetup. Back in the day for me was I would go to Sydney Python. I was in Sydney when I was looking for my first job out of academia. I would go to Sydney Python meetup. I go to SURF, which is the R forum. I go to Data Science Sydney, and then a couple others that I forget. So I'd be at a meetup once a week, once every 2 weeks. And I just, to convince myself that this is okay, I'd say, okay, meet one person and then just chill. And that really helped me through that whole thing. And eventually it became a much easier thing. And now with online meetups, I'm not fussed because I'm at my desk at home. I don't really care. It's easy. And the last thing is to, along those lines as well, especially now that meetups are not as good for networking, just call everybody you know who either has friends who has industry connections, either through programs at universities or are working in a company. When I was at Atlassian, and working in the office in Sydney, I'd have like a coffee a week typically with somebody who just wanted to move to tech. And I'm not the only person who does that. Everybody's happy to do that because, either out of the goodness of their hearts or because they get a referral bonus. It's there are incentives there. If you get a nice, neat little bonus for having a coffee with somebody, it's worth everybody's time. Not to be crass, but people will do this because they like it, but also they have incentives to get smart people in their companies. So don't be shy. It's definitely time well spent for people at these companies, for sure. So let's get to the point of it, because I've gone on really long. It's really it's not very complicated, but it's such a mind shift away from how we write CVs in academia. It's the reason why that happens. The main reason why it's so different is because you're out of context now. If you're an astronomer and applying for a job in astronomy, you don't have to explain any of the context. Even if your PhD is in exoplanets and you're looking at, mathematical cosmology, the context is still there. People understand. It's not like it's a different field. You don't have to do any translation. So it's a very different situation when you're trying to explain what you do to people who, again, don't understand what you do because they've just never encountered that. The recruiters you'll be talking to are smart people who probably haven't met researchers yet. If you're talking to a junior recruiter, a talent person at a tech company, who's just entering that field of recruitment, they probably have never even done a recruitment thing with PhDs. They just don't know. They've just never been exposed to this. So you really have to explain what it is that you do. The first thing that you have to do is make sure that it doesn't sound like you were studying, because that doesn't count because again, it's a different context. If I'm a recruiter, I'm looking at people's CVs, and my understanding of universities that people go there to take courses and learn things, well, it doesn't count the same in my eyes if you did a course for 4 years or if you were at a job for 4 years, because work experience is the most valued thing in industry. And again, it's a context. If you're doing a comms degree and then you go do work in an HR department for 4 years, those aren't equivalent. Those aren't the same level of experience that you accrue during those things. But of course, during a PhD is a job. It's just that we don't call it that. It is very much a job. So you have to present it as such. But at the same time, it's other things that we do, the way we communicate our research, the way we get rewarded for research just doesn't translate. Publications, people are getting an understanding of publications now, and what a peer-reviewed journal is. People are gaining an understanding through COVID, actually, through the past couple of years of really people in the media really publicizing what papers are and what they mean and what peer review means. People are beginning to have an understanding, but it's still not there. So publications just get summarized for me. Going a little backwards in the slides here, but what Malady said before is very important, is that it depends on the job. If you're applying chances are, out of a PhD or postdoc, the likeliest place to get a job will be a big tech company if you're looking for a data job, or a research job or something like that. That's where the majority of jobs are, just because of the size of these companies. If Google is 120,000 people, and the companies that I've worked for are 50 to 200 people, and with the exception of Atlassian, which is also a huge company, no recruiter is going to read the thousands of CVs they're going to receive for that. It's unreasonable. So there are parsers and algorithms that look through these things. So you have to convince the algorithm that your CV is worth a second round. That means you have to be quite assertive. You have to be quite bold about how you present your work. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that you embellish or inflate everything you do, but in academia, we tend to play down things and be quite modest about how we present accomplishments and huge achievements that everybody in this room has. But I'm saying don't downplay, don't embellish, but keep it frank. If you, I'll get to a couple of examples in a minute, but don't say, oh, I was one of, 25 people who helped bring this thing. No, you did a bunch. If you wrote 1,000 lines of code for a project, you wrote 1,000 lines of code for a project. It's not that you were part of a team that did. You have to be a lot more assertive. And for me, that was extremely uncomfortable when I started doing that. But I think my CV is very honest, but it still makes me just shudder when I look at what I wrote there. But it's what you have to do. Leadership experience is another thing. I just bullet up so I don't forget. Leadership experience is very important if you're looking for a job that's not a mid-level job. Your first job out of academia will probably be a senior level job, so it won't require much leadership, but project leadership is always very important to explain, especially at tech companies that tend to be a lot more freeform and allow you to do your own stuff. Time management skills are important. And in the interest of time management, I will skip to the next slide.
I was just going to say, Iraklis, since Caitlin's here, so we will have
okay.
Wrap up.
Oh, sorry. I was feeling a little bit there.
Yes.
So I'm just gonna spend a minute then just to show you the contrast of how this works in my own CV. So this on the right-hand column is just the last CV I had in academia, which I did eventually find after some digging. And it was, again, no context, right? It just says, these are the things I do. These mean something to the people who are going to read them. But on the left, I have 2 pages of a CV for tech. I have a blurb for the company and a blurb for what I did in 1 paragraph each, with the exception of the last section there. It's on Dropbox, the CV, so you can go peruse. But essentially, this is something that makes me very sad, but I've essentially condensed everything that I did in 10 years in academia in 1 paragraph, because it's just not something it's not worth breaking down. It's just not worth the paper. And it's very depressing, but it's what it is. So I have a 2-page CV where I condense all of my 10 years in academia into a couple of sentences, which are the relevant things, the translatable things. And then on my 2nd page, I have my leadership thing. I have my communication skills, which really condenses 10 years of teaching and papers into 1 sentence, which is very depressing, but that's what it is. That's how much it's worth in this context. And then just kind of blurbs here and there about everything that I've done. So really, I guess the main message is, it's difficult and it's very sad and pretty depressing, but you condense all the things that aren't directly relevant to the points that are relevant. The fact that you have publications does matter, because you know how to express yourself. How can I jumble on express yourself? I mean, come on, you know how to express yourself on paper. So that's very important. So you just have to find those translations between what's important. So I can just leave it at that. And do we want to do Q&A now or at the end of both presos?
I will do after Caitlin's, unless someone has an immediate pressing question. Just use the participant button, the hands up.
Font size for the CV. Can you maybe comment on that? Because like with smaller font size, you can definitely show more stuff.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing that.
Yeah.
I was talking about font size.
Font size.
Font size. Oh man, that just, I don't know. I mean, it's all electronic, right? Does it matter? I don't think so. I don't think anybody will print this out ever.
All right, I'm going to take it over to Caitlin. Thank you, Iraklis. That's fantastic. Good news for everyone. In the breakout session, you will have a chance to evaluate or look through what Iraklis is. Thanks, Iraklis. Then we'll go over to our second speaker, Caitlin. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so sorry I was late, but Iraklis, thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective. So
it's awesome. So Caitlin is she works with geospatial. She got a PhD from Swinburne and now works as a geospatial researcher. So works with satellite data, remote sensing, and machine learning. And so she's going to give us her perspective on how the job search and what her inputs are in getting towards an industry job. Caitlin, do you have any slides?
I do. So I'm just going to share my whole screen, hopefully pop this up and put it in full screen. So hopefully you can see that all okay.
Yep.
Great.
Perfect.
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to you today. So I've been out of academia for the last 3 years in a job that I really love. So it's a pleasure to come and talk to you a little bit about what my experience has been with creating, an industry resume, but also in my role, I've had the pleasure to sit on a hiring panel as well. So I wanted to give you sort of the things that I've learned both from being interviewed and interviewing others. There we go. So to tell you a little bit about my background, as Menedik said, I did my PhD at Swinburne, and the parts of my PhD that I loved were, working on challenging problems, particularly using mathematics and Python for computing, but also I was a nervous wreck about it at the start, but by the end of my PhD, I really grew to love giving talks and communication, and it was something I really loved doing and prided myself in doing. And as I sort of got to the end of my PhD, probably a year away from finishing, I just did not feel good about the job market and an option for stability. So because I was a domestic PhD student, I had the fortune to put my PhD on pause and take a leave of absence and actually spend 5 months doing an internship. So I did this at a startup, and it was actually an opportunity created through networking. I spoke to someone that was at CAS whose husband had a startup, and they put me in touch with them. So I do recognize that a lot of these opportunities come up through talking to people, and it's definitely something that's worth doing and exploiting your existing network. So people like me and Iraklis, like how we've talked to you today, we are part of your network now. You can always reach out to us or to Manadeep, who can provide you our details in order to understand more and look for opportunities. But what I was working on at that startup was modeling and forecasting demand for policing services. And I found that I got a lot of value out of being able to help a government service do so much better with their data. They were collecting a lot of data about how many different staff they had at these places and what the demand for different services was, but they weren't making good use of it to make decisions. And so in the work that I did, I was actually able to help them, go back to the government and say, we need this many staff for this many years, and this is how we're going to distribute them across the state, and have this sort of evidence-based reasoning. And given that I really love doing that, I decided that I would finish my PhD and then continue to work for that startup. Unfortunately, like lots of startups, they decided to kind of call it quits a couple of years in. Just it wasn't a sustainable sort of business for them, and it's really hard work getting that sort of stuff off the ground. So luckily, I think the thing that was really positive out of that experience, though, was it gave me, that demonstrated experience of being in the workforce in addition to my PhD, and also gave me like a really solid industry reference that I could use as an advocate for my skills. And I wanted to highlight that at that time I applied for 5 jobs. 3 of those were through people I knew. 2 of them were people I worked at the internship with, and 1 was an ex-astronomer, and then 2 through advertisements. The job I actually got is one of the ones through an advertisement, so I didn't actually know anyone at this job, and I hadn't worked in that field before. But Frontier SI put out a job ad looking for a data scientist with problem-solving skills, Python and Jupyter, and all of these were things I'd done in my PhD. So I applied and got to interview and got it, and I've loved that job since, and it's grown into a really great position for me. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background. So to talk about some of the general advice that I think can be helpful when you're writing your resume is it can be really helpful to break it down into a couple of stages and recognize that your resume doesn't need to be a finished product after you write it one time. You might actually need to revisit it and rework it a few times to really get something that's targeted at what you're trying to do. So one of the best things I think you can do is actually either per job or just in general, whatever works for you, just kind of have a scratch document that contains all the things you've done. And that can be, your work, your outreach, your hobbies, your software, anything, because that allows you to evaluate it objectively in a space that's disconnected from the job you're applying for. And so that way you can hold the job you're applying for in your head and look through your scratch document to say, right, this piece of experience, that's relevant, whereas, this piece maybe not so relevant. And that way you're not already working in the resume document where you feel the need to keep it, exactly to the 2 pages, so on and so forth. So once you've done that, you can sort of review the job description and build your, in your CV template, the bits that are relevant to that direct experience. And one of the things that's important to do, I think the advice about using strong verbs and strong language is important. But I think the other thing to look for is the keywords that are in the ad. And this piece of advice comes from when I was asked to review some resumes for a role, and it is the quickest thing a human can scan for, and actually a computer too, honestly. Like if they've put in a list of, saying you need to know Python and Jupyter, if you don't mention those words in your CV, how can they know that you have that skill? And finally, I think it's really important to have someone else review your work. And I wanted to specifically say that all of you did a very brave and vulnerable thing by presenting your, resumes back to, people like me to give you feedback. Seeking feedback and coming to this workshop is a brave thing to do, because your CV is almost an extension of who you are as a person, and it can feel threatening to have someone review it. But I think what I would add with that is, 1, good on you for doing it. It's amazing. But 2, having someone else review it can help you fill in the gaps that you can be a little bit blind to. Like, we know ourselves so well and we know what we spend all of our time doing. And so it can be really helpful to have an outside perspective to say, hey, but don't you do this as well? Or I think you've not talked about this in a way that, you know, shows your best self, you know, and have someone workshop that with you. Because I think overall, in your CV, you know, you should be able to have content that explains why you should have this job, because that's really what you're doing with this document. It's not just a flat statement of this is who I am. It's this is who I am and why, you know, and that's why I'm a good fit. Like, I'm this person and this is why I should get this job. And I think this like brings me to another thing that I was thinking about as I wrote this talk, is that your resume is a 2-page piece of paper that's your best representative. So if you're applying to jobs, you know, without a network relationship, this resume is the only piece of thing they know about you. And so it's your best opportunity to communicate that, who you are and why you should get an interview. So I think it can be really helpful to, you know, to draft it, but then take another look and say, well, you know, how would my biggest advocate describe what I do? If you have, you know, a really close friend or a trusted mentor, how would they describe what you do? Because they're the people who are going to say the best things about you. And so if you can think about it from their perspectives, maybe that can help subvert some of the self-consciousness that comes with having to describe yourself in this big way that can feel really intimidating. I think the other important thing to remember is that humans are really story-oriented a lot of the time. And so if you can find a way to craft the sentences in your resume that, you know, explain what you did, how you did it, and why it was important, that's going to be a lot more meaningful than just saying you have a skill. You know, if I say, you know, I have skills in Python, that's, you know, sure, great, I tick that box. But if I say, you know, in my previous work, I used Python to clean this data for a machine learning algorithm that, you know, achieved this, that communicates a lot more to a person who's reviewing it. And finally, like you're doing with this, this workshop, it's really good to ask other people for advice. But equally important is that you should ignore it if it doesn't feel right. Certainly I've had, you know, I've given my resume to people I trusted and gotten their feedback, but it's such a, it can be such a personal document that they might give you advice that you just don't like and it doesn't sit right with you. And at the end of the day, it's your work. I mean, I actually feel like it's kind of similar to some of the choices I made when I wrote my PhD thesis of, it's your document. Like, if you don't like what someone suggests, it's just a suggestion and it's your choice to look for what's valuable about that suggestion for you, because maybe that person's way of representing themselves isn't the right fit for you. So try things, take advice, you know, ignore it, do what feels, you know, what makes you feel like you've represented your sort of strongest and best self on paper. And finally, just to summarize, as a couple of general tips, I sort of talked about, you know, how you should write about your experience. And I think it's useful to kind of couch it in, you know, really clear language of, I solved problem X using skill Y, which led to outcome Z. Obviously, you shouldn't have spelling mistakes like I had, because I always confused lead with lead. Whoops. I think it's good to keep it to 2 pages. When I interviewed for my current role, they had everybody's CVs printed out, and having it printed out means if it's just 2 pages, it can fit on a single page. So even if lots of stuff is digital now, the general expectation seems to be 2 pages. So keep it to that. And finally, the other thing that's important is that you should assume your reviewer is time poor. They probably won't follow a link in your resume. And I hate saying that because I wish that, when I did do it, when I was a reviewer, I wish I had the time to follow people's links. But in reality, this is a part of someone's job and they're expected to do a lot of other things as well. So I think it can still be really good and important to provide the link because it's a piece of evidence, but you should assume they won't click it. And consequently, you should be providing a summary that explains what you want the reviewer to know. Like if you gave a media interview, that's an incredible demonstration of your communication skills. And what you should do is, rather than assume they'll go and watch that 5-minute video, say that, you were able to do that experience, you summarized really difficult concepts into an easy to understand method, or you had lots of engagement, or anything like that. So yeah, those are my broad tips. And that's what I had to present. So thanks for coming along and thanks for listening. I'm always really happy to engage with people about how to pivot in your career or make academia more of what you want for you, or how to live a life that works for you, because it's something that I went through at the time, and I now really do have a life that works for me, and I'm very happy.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yep, that was great. Thank you. All right, so we have some time for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Seems like people are still thinking and typing. In the meantime, maybe I can start off with a question of my own. So oh no, Adam has a question. So let's go with Adam first. Adam, go.
I mean, your question might have been better, Anshu, but that's okay. In all of these industry jobs, are you only ever submitting a CV? Because you know how in academic jobs you have like a cover letter and stuff on top of that. Are there those like ancillary documents that you submit with it, or is it just like everything needs to be on the 2 pages and catered towards the job that you're applying for? End of question.
Yeah, I can take that one first. So, I mean, when I last applied for jobs, which was admittedly 3 years ago, I did supply a cover letter for most of them. And I think the cover letter is actually like a nice opportunity to expand. Like, it's good to still keep the resume really short and targeted and focused, but the cover letter is a really good place to expand on things that were in the selection criteria that you sort of couldn't fully explain in the CV. So as an example, when I applied for the Frontier ASA job, they asked, did you have any experience with spatial data? And I used the cover letter as an opportunity to say, well, I actually participated in like the NASA Space Apps hack and used some spatial data in that. So the cover letter is a good way to be able to flesh out some of those things. So yeah, that's certainly been my experience. But Iraklis, do you have something to add too?
Yeah, same for me. So I tend to, I essentially never change my CV, which is not necessarily advice, but it's just what's worked for me. So I keep my CV exactly the same for every job, but then use the cover letter to do that extra keyword matching that Caitlin was talking about. That's a really, really good piece of advice. So I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but that's what I do. So if I'm able to submit a cover letter and they don't specifically say, don't send us one, I will always send a cover letter. And then I tend to apply for not a huge range of jobs right now. So I have 2 or 3 cover letters that I then will adapt. So if I'm applying for a role like what I have now, which is a leadership role, I'll use one. If I, for some reason, want to go back to being an individual contributor, so a technical person, I'll use a cover letter. Essentially, I'll go back to the last time I applied for a role like that and tweak that one to match the keywords. So I think it just adds a lot more personality to your application. So if you're able to, I'd say always do.
The other thing you can do as well always is they will almost always provide some sort of contact details. So during the prior stage before they close the position, you can always reach out and ask questions, which generally shows that you're interested and engaged in the role. So for the things that you think are really special, certainly not for everything, like if you're just putting in an application to see what happens, but if you think there's a job out there that's really special and you really want it, going that extra mile to get in contact and say, hey, I saw this job, it looks amazing. Is it doing this, this, and this, or is it more of this sort of role? Or like, could I talk to you for 10 minutes just to understand a bit more about it? That can be a really good way to, get that additional insight that helps make your application stand out above other people's.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. We have a question from Nicole. Do you need to have citizenship or PR to get an industry job in Australia, New Zealand, US, etc.?
I'd say, so my experience has been a mix. So it's generally easier to not have to deal with that, but it hasn't been an issue for me. When I moved away from academia, I had 2 jobs in Australia before I had PR. So I had to get a new visa, which was a drag, but it doesn't matter. And then I had to change visas again to get my next job at Atlassian. Then I got PR. And then we got this amazing opportunity to move here, so I didn't use it anymore. But here in New Zealand, I've got the equivalent of permanent residency because Australian permanent residency counts in New Zealand for jobs. So it's a lot easier if somebody doesn't have a sponsor, and that's definitely true of smaller companies that don't necessarily have the resources. But when I was going to Atlassian, for example, they didn't care at all. It was so easy for them to just go through the paperwork because they had a person in charge of doing paperwork because they're a big company, and they were hiring so much from abroad that this was an everyday activity for them. So in my experience, it will depend on the company. And then citizenship specifically, for government jobs, very often you'll need citizenship. And sometimes more than that. I mean, sometimes you'll need to have been in the country for many, many years to get a government job. So those things happen. And I say this specifically because one really good avenue for people with academic experience is defense. And in that situation, you might have to have citizenship and have been in the country for quite a while. So it's always worth checking that fine print before you apply for a job like that. Because you want to waste your time or the department's time, basically, when you're doing that. And that's actually a good opportunity to send that email and ask a couple more questions.
All right.
That's right. If it's a requirement, they should say. And if they don't say, but you're worried about it, you can always ask.
In fact, that's a really good point, because sometimes sometimes it's boilerplate. So I know even when I was working in astronomy, the boilerplate thing that went out from the Department of Industry, whatever we were, was you have to have permanent residency or be a citizen to apply for this job, and that wasn't true. But we weren't able to get it off the application. So sometimes the requirement is stated, but it can be flexible, and sometimes the requirement is not stated because they're not used to getting applications from non-citizens. So it's worth asking, because sometimes just human error.
Thanks.
I think I was going to have a quick stop there, take a 2-minute break, and then come back for our next session. Thank you both, Caitlin and Iraklis, both of you, for this fantastic discussion. Then, yes. Thank you. Please feel free to stick around. The next session, which we will start at 3, we will have breakout sessions, breakout rooms to read resumes. We'll have a single page resume that we're all going to read, and then try to understand how to convert our academic CVs into industry resumes, right? So we'll have a breakout group. So take a 2 minutes break. Thank you both for your talk. So did people want to talk about sort of what they found? Who was in breakout room 1? Henry, do you want to? Oh, Tristan. One of you, do you want to talk about what you got out of what you found?
Yeah, sure. So a kind of major comment was that a lot of them are like really long, like 4 to 5 pages, which is not what I was expecting for industry resumes. Something else we noticed is that a lot of them listed publications, which again is something I wasn't expecting people to put on industry resumes. Our favorite ones were the ones that used a bit of color that had like more white space. It just makes them easier to read if you'd only have a minute or so to scan it. Whereas ones that had really big chunks of text where nothing was like highlighted or bolded or anything were like kind of difficult to scan, because like you're kind of like, well, I guess I have to read this whole thing then. Yeah. What else was there? And yeah, like it's sort of interesting when you read these, you sort of notice where your eye naturally wants to go to on the page. And like on a couple of the resumes, your eye goes to somewhere where they clearly didn't want there to be the emphasis. Like there'd be all this important stuff in regular font and then like a big black heading, and your eye would instantly go to that heading even though it's not the most important thing on the page. So yeah, that's sort of our major comments.
All right. Does anyone want to go next? Share?
I think from our breakout room, the main thing that jumped out was how instead of having lists of points and achievements, how every CV had these long sentences and explanation of what they did in their specific role and why they did it and what they achieved. So essentially provided context for the responsibilities and the achievements, rather than just listing, okay, I got this publication or I got this award or something.
Yeah, it's the context is important. I forget who was saying the understanding. I think it was Caitlin. The understanding the context of what you were doing. So if you apply Python to solve a problem, then that's good to know. Right? That gives more context rather than Python that way. So basically, from us, it was similar to that. Sanjeev, I'm going to try to summarize. It was difficult. You have to condense your information and figure out how to quickly convey that across. Was there any other rooms?
Yeah. From our room, to add on to the things that you guys said, one of them was that the headings seemed to be one of the most important things to determine whether or not you wanted to even read the content. And also, like, how you phrase things is important. So, if you are scanning to see if someone's good at something, you're looking for those keywords. And so saying that you're good at something and then backing it up with evidence seemed to be more impactful than having evidence. This means I'm good at this. Also, that the summary at the top was really important if you only have a minute to understand who somebody is. That was the quickest way to find out.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That's great. Iraklis, did you? I don't know if you did the exercise of.
Sorry, no, I had to skip out.
Okay. All right.
I'm just back now.
So hopefully that gives you a sense of some options, some ways that you might style your resume, what to keep in, what to keep out, how you might lay out your resumes. Again, keeping it closer to the shorter side is probably better. Definitely, that was one thing. And then you can see how you can adapt your existing CV, academic CV, and make the changes to make it look more like the bits of resumes that you liked, right? Having a summary statement on top, make it easy to parse, put some color in. So I think that brings us to the end of our session today. Thank you again, Iraklis, for coming on and giving us your time. I hope you all enjoyed it. For those that did submit resumes, you should have gotten your feedback already. And just hopefully that's very productive. For next week's session is another session on the how-to series that's being organized by Henry, who's on here. So it's the same thing, same time next week. It's about the theoretical sides of applying for jobs, right, Henry? All right. If there's nothing urgent that comes up, then thank you all for coming.